Okay, so it is 12 o'clock. So I'm going to go ahead and get started because we do only have 30 minutes today. I see some familiar names. I see some new names, which is great. I'm glad that we have some people on here that are possibly new to our webinar. So welcome. Thank you for joining. My name is Elizabeth Keating Matthews. I am with the Florida Institute for Child Welfare. Today, Dr. Morgan Cooley will be with us. She is going to speak on her findings. I'll let her give her description. She's probably much better at it than I am. Just a little bit of housekeeping before I pass it over to her. We do only have 30 minutes today. I'm hoping that we will have plenty of time to answer your questions throughout the presentation. Feel free, put stuff in the chat. If there are things that I can respond to with chat, I'll just jump right in. If not, Morgan will kind of take that over once her presentation part is done. And then at the conclusion, we do have a short survey for you. I will share in the chat just to get your feedback on how the presentation went and what your expectations were and if we met those expectations. If you have any questions, feel free, message me in the chat or email me after the fact, and we will try to get answers for you or connect you to whoever you need to be connected to. So without further ado, Morgan, I'm going to pass it over to you. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you all so much for coming today. So one thing that I noticed as I put this together is that to boil 100 pages of facilitator interviews, 66 pages of administrator interviews, and even more from foster caregivers and parents. And so I just want to let you know that this is like this much of what's going on, and it's also presented in a package, and we'll have a final report out coming soon for those of you who want to kind of see results that are more broken down by group and that are more detailed. So please bear with me as I sort through these details, but I'm really excited to talk to you all today. Let me get my screen share going here. So I wasn't going to do such a detailed PowerPoint at first, but like I said, there's so many wonderful details. And so I want to make sure that I get that covered. Hold on just a second. Let me turn on the slideshow here. All right. Hopefully I have my timings. Oh, hold on a second. Sorry, guys. Sometimes I forget which one I'm using here. So we're going to move over to the screen here. Okay. Can you see my slides?
We see your PowerPoint, like awesome. the edit side, not the presentation side.
The edit side, not the presentation side. Okay, sorry guys, I've been having some camera challenges. How's that? No, okay.
No.
All right, we're going to go with this and we'll just follow along. Thank you guys. Welcome to the joys of technology. Even though I've been doing this now with you all during COVID, sometimes my technology will not cooperate with me. So I just want to kind of throw out some quick thank yous to, there are so many people I could thank to. So my team who has been working with me on this, to DCF and my CBC partners who have been assisting with recruitment and participation, with my amazing parent co-facilitator and my parent advocates who are helping me recruit families. We're still working on recruiting families. I'm just going to throw that out there. And then also for FCWA for their funding and support. Launching this during COVID as a policy and launching this in evaluation during COVID has been somewhat challenging, but we've been really lucky to have some good partners and gotten some really helpful and interesting results from this early implementation. I want to focus, just your attention that this is an early implementation evaluation. It's not meant to say this is the success or the end all be all of comfort calls. It's just kind of what's going well, what is, kind of presenting as a challenge in these early days. And so just to remind you for us in the state of Florida, comfort calls are facilitated by a child welfare agency representative and the foster parent kin or fictive kin caregiver with the birth parent after a child's removed. Those calls are supposed to happen within 12 to 48 hours. There's some flexibility as to how and when those calls happen. And kind of those original intentions that came out from the statute were to comfort children, to initiate early conversation between birth parents and caregivers, with kind of like that future intent of creating a co-parenting relationship from the very beginning. But really, the most important thing is to share relevant and pertinent information about the child's needs as they enter an out-of-home placement. And so really what these calls represent are a statewide priority and legislative mandate that these relationships between birth parents and foster parents or caregivers, whatever the situation is, are important and beneficial to everybody. There's a lot of research and not a lot of research on these kind of relationships. There's very little research on comfort calls and kind of what really makes this successful. So we're going in a little blind, just a little bit, but we're also excited to kind of share these findings in the future. There's about 2 decades or so of really developed kind of co-parenting or shared parenting research. And usually what we see is that parents experience a range of feelings after removal. We also know that children experience a range of feelings. A lot of times they might experience loyalty binds when their foster caregiver or their birth parent or their parent don't always get along in those situations. And so just kind of understanding this early rationale that people need comfort. And I can also share from the foster caregiver literature that adjusting to working within a child welfare system can be really complex for foster families too. Caregivers are often the gatekeepers for children in birth families. So they help to promote or facilitate communication, or sometimes they might not promote or facilitate that communication or block that communication. And that can be whether they are related to the birth family or whether they're not. So it's really important to understand that shared relationship, there's many people involved in that, and that caregivers play a really important role. There's multiple benefits to caregivers or parents, caregivers, and youth when there's positive and ongoing communication, early relationships. And usually that's facilitated by open, direct, and warm communication by parents and caregivers. It helps them to kind of navigate co-parenting. It helps them to collaborate. And when we say co-parenting, it is talking about shared responsibilities, sharing information, learning what works for the child, helping the caregiver to understand what that child needs when they're in their home, helping the parents to understand what's going well when that child can't be with their parent. But ultimately, another thing that this research really does reinforce is that the parent is the parent, and that child's relationship with that parent is very important, even when they're in out-of-home care. So for this evaluation, just to kind of run through some of the pieces, we moved from an online survey to focus groups because we initially had a low response, but I will tell you that moving to the interviews really allowed for a lot of depth and for this early evaluation to get some really important information that hopefully we can kind of continue to expand on in the future. We used a thematic analysis. We had 12 administrators who are involved in the planning and implementation throughout some of those early days. We had 21 call facilitators, 10 foster caregivers, and right now we have 2 parents. So we're working on getting more parents. That is, I will tell you a little bit more about those efforts if there's time afterward. Right now we're using convenience and purposive sampling because we do need to have people who have had a comfort call participate, and we've been doing virtual or Zoom interviews so that we make sure that we can get people at different times during and after work hours and all of those wonderful things. Kind of the general questions we're asking are what were their initial impressions of the helpfulness of comfort calls, and this is across all of the different groups. Mostly for the administrators and facilitators, how they feel about the implementation of comfort calls in their agency or their area, and what were some of the successes, some of the challenges, and then also whether there were changes in their impressions of the helpfulness of comfort calls over time and what their suggestions were. So I'm going to break them down as much as possible to summarize. Like I said, there are 66 pages of admin interviews, 110 pages of facilitator interviews, and slightly less for the other groups, but just to kind of give some of the initial findings that are coming out here. So the administrators really highlighted their role in kind of planning and implementing these calls. Implementation is or was and still is complex. It can be laborious and challenging, but it's worth it for families. I think every single administrator talked about this policy being important, about seeing benefits, about understanding benefits, all of those things. They just also talked about the realistic challenge of working in a complex child welfare system, to implement a statewide mandate during COVID, when everything else was being moved and changed and adjusted and all of that. They talked about turnover, during these last couple of years. It's a multi-component policy for the state of Florida. So Comfort Call is one piece of 3 different legislative components. And that made it kind of difficult because some of the early trainings that came through covered multiple parts, but sometimes things might have been not in order of like what comes first, or it might have been kind of covering like the history of like the legislation overall, or different things. They talked about kind of the lack of infrastructure, technology, culture. For example, we've been trying to look at what the implementation rates are across the state. But there wasn't one statewide reporting system established from the beginning. And even though there's been some attempts, we're still not in a place where we can just pull a number or a report right from our computer system. So it also put a lot of the middle administration in charge for making big changes and making plans. And so sometimes, middle administration has many tasks and they need to communicate that importance, but also get buy-in from above and from below that chain of command and those kind of things. And so it did put a big ask on them. And really, like a few of them just said, like, I have been, or I have had champions for comfort calls, and that's often come from the middle administration. People talked about privatization as important because we have many different CBCs, community-based care agencies, with many different needs, but also it became a barrier when there wasn't always like a top-down guideline or like role for support. And sometimes a little bit of top-down guidance is needed. And then they also talked about how, some people had the chance to pilot before the mandate came through. And so they had this ability to kind of like test or make adjustments over time and kind of build culture among their workers and caregivers. And it just made things a little smoother over time for them. Among the facilitators, what we did find is that I will say overall, our facilitators are amazing and they're supportive and they're awesome, but they express some initial reluctance or hesitance because, a lot of the calls are completed by investigators who are completing removals, and removals are usually the last thing that investigators do. And it's also the most difficult. And so for that person who's removing that child to be the one to facilitate the comfort call, there are times when they create this amazing relationship with a parent and are able to kind of facilitate that and they're the right person. But a lot of times the investigators were they had some very difficult experiences, or there was just a lot of anxiety because some of them don't do removals very often. And so like having to do that call in the context of also having to do the removal can be very hard. Facilitators are the gatekeepers of comfort calls in many ways. So they are the ones who, they ensure that they get scheduled, they happen. There's different ways of doing comfort calls. Some agencies are using investigators, some have a transition team, some people are using placing or licensing staff, for example. And so among that too, like some of them express this ultimate empathy and understanding for families, while others express some struggles and some challenges or some negative experiences, like parents not understanding the boundaries of calls, or, just being concerned about, whether children would be re-traumatized on a call if somebody was upset or crying or those kind of things. And so, that kind of like goes to the other points is that, comfort calls require really good boundaries. Most go smoothly. But you do have to have good boundaries in place and to kind of follow like tip sheets or guidelines. But then on the other hand, a lot of people, because of turnover or because of the large number of people in the state of Florida, a lot of people didn't get the training or resources necessarily that helped them at first. A few of them said, I really learned as I go, or I had to adapt it because what I received wasn't necessarily helpful for me at the time. And this is not everybody. Some people said my training was great, the videos were great, or this was great. But like a lot of people, even when they had good access to materials, they really felt like they needed, training or resources that was helpful for them to kind of figure out, what does this look like for me? So overall, I bring in a lot of challenges, but remember to kind of early implementation of something so big and so huge. It's required a culture shift, it's required a work shift, it's required training, it's required a lot of adjusting. And for the most part, everybody's been very supportive. There's been a good amount of buy-in. And I think some of it is just kind of working through like some of the new pieces of this legislation. And like I said, I don't think I've had one person say like, get rid of it. Most people are like, I hope they don't get rid of it because now we're working hard and like things are starting to fall into place a little bit more easily. So we're kind of still moving through a lot of the caregiver and parent stuff right now, and we're still collecting information from parents over the next month before our report is due on the 28th. But for caregivers, one thing we noticed is that newer caregivers are really just adjusting to their role in fostering, and whether it was mentioned in pre-service or not, they're kind of just getting their feet wet, their feet on the ground, and trying to understand like what, their role is and what their task is. And then for those who have been around a little bit, the majority really do buy in. They understand the importance, and they understand the importance for the child, for the parent, and for them as the caregiver too. The majority did not get formal training in pre-service among the groups we talked about, even some of the newer ones. Or they didn't get an in-service training, but they did get individualized prep and follow-up that they found was really helpful. They said that when I asked them would they have wanted a formal training or would they wanted a handout, a lot of them said, I really just want somebody to kind of check in with me and explain this to me and kind of give me that like support or guidance, especially like if I'm brand new, like having that kind of personalized attention was really helpful. Boundaries and relationships can shift between parents and caregivers over time, and a lot of them a lot of the ones who have been around a little longer weren't necessarily prepared for those kind of things, but as they got more experience, they bought into the calls a little more, but they also learned, when are situations where I might need to put up a different boundary or like kind of how to approach. But a lot of times foster caregivers felt like they needed to kind of figure that out for themselves. Like I need to figure out my boundaries for my family, within this context. And so we're not quite sure what to do with that exactly. But I do think that kind of leans to the importance of having that ongoing support or consultation with those who are facilitating the calls or implementing the calls. So among our 2 parents who have participated, who have been awesome, I can't imagine answering questions about something so sensitive. And so we always express a lot of gratitude for them for their time. They said that these calls are not just important, but they're necessary for their motivation and support. One of them, literally said that if I did not get to talk to my child within the first couple of days, I think I would have lost it and you wouldn't see me here right now. So those calls for them were immensely important. They also talked about, one of them talked about how much they really needed their facilitator to help them because they had a relationship with the caregiver prior to that child being put in the home, and there was a conflict going on, and that call facilitator was able to kind of bridge that divide and help them to deal with that conflict, and that was really important for them. They also talked about how they wish that the comfort call would have been more of like a launching place for additional follow-up other than the MDT while they were waiting for visitation to start. Their multidisciplinary team meeting, they said, sometimes it's really stressful because caregivers and other people are on the call and there's a lot of stuff being talked about. It's not all positive related to parents. And so to move from the comfort call into a meeting where there's often more negative information shared or more challenging information shared or more just business shared in general, they just would really like for it to be like the launching ground for more kind of interaction and support. So those are kind of those early findings from our groups. So when we think about implications and recommendations, like I said, we're going to filter these out and sort them by group for a report. And I think that'll be really nice to see kind of where that overlap lays. When we're thinking about the administration, they talked about testing implementation a little bit more, creating more flexibility for piloting before launching that legislative mandate. That's really important. There's just a lot of pressure and a lot of burden comes with pressure to implement when there's a mandate. And everybody wanted to do a good job. We have a lot of really hard workers. The other part is communicating the importance and value for calls throughout the planning and implementation. So everybody needs to understand the success stories. Everybody needs concise and engaging training. And also just to kind of remember like what that looks like or how that is beforehand. Oh, and I forgot to mention too, with the testing implementation, a lot of them talked about how, making ongoing changes or shifts, having to shift how they log calls in the system, those kind of things, it's really hard. So having a lot of that like everything really needs to be ready to go. So like you literally can hit a button and your new module pops up in your training, your nudge shows up in your computer system to tell you here's where you log your comfort call, those kind of things. A couple of the different groups across the facilitators, the caregivers and the parents talked about having a neutral party was really helpful. What I really liked is that a lot of our administrators and our call facilitators talked about the facilitator being the super engager. They're a non-judgmental party. They're just there to engage and to facilitate. And so like to have somebody who is just the ultimate people person. We had a lot of positive talk for our facilitators. Ensuring facilitators know that parents have a right to a comfort call and a right to talk to their children was important. There were some facilitators who talked about not having or choosing not to have children on the call because they were worried about the children, and sometimes that's appropriate if there's harm or legal reasons not to include them, but also that not having that access to the child early on, or seeing that child or just hearing that child's voice could also be hard for the parent too. Ensure that parents know they get a comfort call. We had trouble with recruiting parents, and just in full disclosure, we originally recruited through the Department of Children and Families or through CBCs. And what I ended up having to do was go through some peer support specialists or parent support advocates, and to get to parents for now, but hopefully more in the future. But what I'm finding is with the 5 advocates that I'm working with across the state is that the vast majority of parents they're working with have not had a comfort call. And I know that that is skewed because I'm working with people who are in different places or whatever, but the fact that we're having trouble finding parents who have had a comfort call has been it's been challenging. We're not really sure what to do with that information, but I've had 5 people all across the state of Florida, and the majority of the people that they're working with at this moment have not had a comfort call. Engaging foster caregivers at pre-service and throughout implementation to ensure they understand the calls and that they're feeling supported as well. Coming into fostering can be really difficult, and you don't know sometimes what you're doing until you step in. I think everybody on this call can probably empathize with that. And then also looking at the comfort call as the beginning of continued engagement and communication between parents, caregivers, and children would be helpful. I did not put the references in yet, but I have them on a list. So if anybody wants them, I just want to share my email, and I'll put it in the chat too, but my email is cooleym@fau.edu, and I'll copy paste that in the chat, but take this off so we can have some time for questions and things. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Morgan. That was great. I know it was a crash course, but
yeah. Lots of information, hundreds of pages of information. So thank you for the patience. Yeah.
Yes. But yeah, so we have a good 8 minutes or so. If there's anyone who wants to put in a question in the chat or is feeling like they want to come off mute and ask their question, you're more than welcome to do that. Or if you wanted to do the raise your hand and we'll identify you, that's fine too.
Richard, I see your hand. Feel free to just jump in there.
Yeah, so I think that this is great. The whole idea of a comfort call. I'm concerned that it's focused on the parent's comfort, that this is about meeting a parental need as opposed to a child's need. And so I kind of want to challenge that. We think about the parent may be distressed, but the real person in crisis is the child, and that this is more for a child than it is for a parent. As adults, needing to meet the needs of the parent and needing to develop a cooperative co-parenting relationship, I understand it. But I just want to challenge that we think about this more so for the child's need in maintaining that relationship with their parent and encouraging this co-parenting relationship around the child's needs. And I know that that's what this does, but I'm just saying to talk about it from that perspective is much more helpful for me in terms of being an advocate for children in difficult situations.
I think, sorry.
Nope, that's right. I just wanted to make that point.
Yeah, I think that is right on point. And so one of the things that I did not get to bring in today was that when the call happens so early on in placement, Sometimes it happens immediately when the children arrive at the foster home. The child might, a lot of the facilitators have indicated that the child might not feel ready, or that they don't feel the child is ready to participate in the call at that time. A lot of removals are with younger children, like newborns and infants. And so like medically, there might be a reason where that child is not present, or if it's an infant and child, a lot of times like they'll appear on the call, but that call is happening between the parent and the caregiver. But I absolutely agree that comfort call is also for that child, and that's important. There's just different reasons like when and why children haven't been involved. And a lot of times, that falls on the facilitator to make the decision as to whether that child is on the call. And that's also something I think that's a really important implication for people to talk about before they do comfort calls, and how and in what cases are children maybe in a good place to participate or not in a good place to participate. Some people have even recommended that the call not happen for a day or two, like a day after call or something like that. But there's been kind of mixed findings as to whether people think that immediate call is helpful, because if you have allergies or you have sleep needs, like having that information like right then is so important. But it's also it can be very chaotic and very difficult time for the child too. Thanks, Richard.